What's up, world? I'm Matt Newberg from HNGRY, and this is The Feed. Each episode, we'll dive into conversations with the industry insiders who are leveraging technology to shape the way we eat. On today's episode of The Feed, I sat down with Jeffrey Dietrich, founder and CEO of Rarebird, a modern coffee company building a new replacement to caffeine without the jitters. In this episode, we'll talk about the 60% of the population who are slow caffeine metabolizers, how Rarebird is leveraging a metabolite called Paraxanthine, and the various adaptogens that it's infusing into its portfolio of coffees to support long-term cognitive health. All right, Jeffrey, it's a pleasure to have you here. Really excited to dive in here. I'd love for you to just start off by talking about your background, starting with your PhD at Berkeley to founding Lygos, what you did there, and then kind of what was the impetus for Rarebird.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, Matt, I'm kind of a technologist at heart. I did my PhD at UC Berkeley in bioengineering, and I was working in Dr. Jay Kiesling's lab, who was really one of the founders of this field of synthetic biology, which kind of at a high level is how do you use engineering principles, apply them towards biology to make things for the world. And my first project was working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on an anti-malarial pharmaceutical, and that ended up resulting in a startup company, Amyris, that's now public. And I wasn't involved with Amyris, but I got to see kind of the origin story of that company, how it got started, raising capital, kind of going from there. And I really got bit by the entrepreneur bug at that point in time, where I saw really the ability for someone who's relatively young in the field as a scientist to kind of jump in, create difference for the world, go out, start a lab, and just do big things. Where in the traditional academic path, that's pretty challenging. So right out of graduate school, I co-founded Lygos, which was an industrial biochemicals company focused on how you can take renewable resources like sugar and convert them into chemicals that would replace petroleum-derived chemicals. And so it's really like pie in the sky, big vision. How do you change the world? Love doing it, but the challenge there is it's all about economies of scale, right? These are industries that have been around for hundreds of years. They're entrenched. They have lots of subsidies. You need a $300 million production facility to get to market. It's just challenging. So I took a step back and said, where can you take the same idea, the same technology, and apply it towards something that's, you don't need to be at this tremendous scale to get something to market, but it will still benefit humankind. And we'll kind of go through the Rarebird story and the origin, in this conversation and in more detail as well.
Awesome. Love that you've been able to, dive straight into, applying your knowledge and what that kind of creates now with Rarebird. I'd love for you to just kind of talk a little bit more about your relationship with caffeine, kind of as a founder historically, and kind of how that's kind of shaped your viewpoint.
Yeah, my relationship has changed a lot over time. I started drinking coffee, as with most people, in college. I think like my freshman year was probably when I started. And I actually remember like the very first few times like I had coffee, like that spark, like that energy it brings. I was like, whoa, this is like game changing, right? Like this is what you need when you have to wake up at like, 7 a.m., 8 a.m. and go to class when you're used to like staying awake, till 1, 2 a.m. in the morning at that point in my life. Obviously like that isn't sustainable, and kind of my lifestyle changed. I became looking at coffee as part of like my daily routine where I'd have it in the morning just to like help me get started, get to work, get going. And also scientists and engineers, we drink a lot of coffee generally, right? As a group, we drink the most coffee, I think, of anyone. So it was something that I was drinking a lot of. And what I found is that over time, it wasn't really giving like that same burst of energy. It was something that I needed to have to wake up in the morning. But then also, if I was feeling a lot of stress, it was just going to exacerbate that. And that was not something I experienced in graduate school, but it was something I experienced when I got into the world of startups, which is a very, high stress, jumping from one thing to the next type world, where it's always like, what fire are you putting out? So I began to recognize that caffeine may not be ideal for me. And that really began this process of me exploring what else is out there. Should I be drinking coffee at all? Are there alternatives? And it kind of began a whole exploration that took, several years before I arrived at, our caffeine replacement we're working on today.
Awesome. I'd love to just step back for a second and just give us a layman's description of what caffeine actually is. And I guess, just explain why. I think there's a stat out there that's like 90% of adults in the U.S. consume coffee. Curious how that breaks down as far as like usage, right? Like, is that 1 cup a day? Is that like frequent, like, daily versus just a few times a week? What those segments are? But yeah, give us like kind of the high level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best place to start is, where does caffeine come from? It is produced by a variety of different plants. So it's not just coffee and tea. We kind of think of them as being the most common sources of caffeine. But there are other species, guarana, yerba mate, even citrus produce some amounts of caffeine, where it's really a natural pesticide or insecticide, where it's the plant makes these compounds, caffeine and other related alkaloids, to stop insects from chewing on the leaves, eating the berries, destroying the plant. Fortuitously, though, caffeine looks a lot like adenosine, which is a natural brain neurotransmitter that regulates, along with melatonin, our sleep and wake cycles. And so we kind of hijacked caffeine and made it our own and use it as a stimulant, where we consume it in the morning to try to wake up, really change or reset that sleep-wake cycle that our body's going through. And because of that, and not surprisingly, it is the most widely consumed pharmacologically active compound on the face of the earth, right? Like bar none. And so, as you mentioned, about 90% of people, I think, consume caffeine. I don't think it's necessarily coffee,
right?
But caffeine in any form. Coffee, though, in the U.S. is the most consumed source of caffeine. And so second to water, coffee is the most consumed beverage. About 2/3 of people actually consume coffee daily, so like every single day. And those people are spending between $1,000 and $2,000 a year on coffee and coffee products, right? So you kind of think about this in the scope of like a person's budget. Say like the median income is like $75,000 to $100,000, somewhere in that range for these consumers. It's 1% to 2% of people's budget is going towards coffee, which is kind of insane when you think about it.
That's amazing. It is a fundamental part of adulthood and just life in general. Especially for me, I cannot function without it. I can say that. Real quickly, could you just talk a little bit about the adenosine component, kind of the circadian rhythm, and then what caffeine is doing to potentially maybe inhibit the adenosine and kind of its contribution to maybe a crash in the afternoon?
Yeah, for sure. We can kind of start kind of high level. We can jump into some detail where it's interesting. So there are a variety of adenosine receptors in the brain. There's 4 of them. As relates to coffee, kind of 2 are important. But adenosine is the natural neurotransmitter that when there's very low levels in the brain, we're awake. And throughout the day, adenosine levels are going to build up. And they reach a critical point where it starts to make us feel sleepy. So it's kind of this concentration-dependent effect within the brain. And we call this sleep pressure or sleep drive. And it's really related to how much adenosine is there. And you can ignore that urge, and you can try to like make yourself stay awake, 9, 10, 11 p.m., but that adenosine level is just going to keep rising the longer you stay up. And that's why you get sleepier and sleepier, just because like that drive is getting larger. Caffeine is very interesting in that it looks structurally very, very similar to adenosine. So much so that it can actually bind to these adenosine receptors, but it doesn't activate them. It binds and blocks them. So adenosine can't bind to them any longer. And so in effect, your body is sitting there thinking there's this very, very low concentration amount of adenosine just because it can't get in to the receptor. And that's why coffee has that alertness, that awakefulness property where it can make us feel like it's 9, 10 a.m. if you have, a Red Bull or a coffee at 9 p.m., right? It's basically kind of doing that reset. The challenge, of course, is that the adenosine is not going away. It's still kind of sitting there waiting. And then once that caffeine starts to leave the receptor, it's getting metabolized by the body, cleared out of the body. Now there's a really high concentration of adenosine just sitting there waiting. It all kind of crashes into these receptors. And that's that feeling of like that caffeine crash that people can have, whether it's the afternoon or like, 2 a.m. if you've been like drinking a Red Bull out of a club or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually a fan of the yerba mate at the club. Well, in my club days, now I'm a boring 30 in my mid 30s. But yeah, I can tell. I stopped drinking coffee after I think about 8 hours. When it's about 8 hours before I'm about to go to bed for my normal bedtime. That was something that Dr. Eric Huberman mentioned on his podcast, and I've started to adopt that. But it's definitely fascinating. And then as far as the plant component of caffeine, what if we were to taste this caffeine, like it wouldn't taste good on our taste buds, is that right?
Oh, it would not. I mean, it's pretty bitter. If you just put like a little bit on your fingertip and taste it, like it's a pretty adverse response or reaction that you'll have to it. And the bitterness is probably more like a human intuition of like, this can be something that's dangerous, right? Bitter things are oftentimes dangerous or toxic when consumed at high levels. And similarly, insects have that same response when they're consuming or trying to eat a caffeinated plant, right? They taste that bitterness and then they know, okay, like this plant is not something I want to consume more of, or they're going to start to experience kind of the, pesticide or insecticide effects that caffeine can have.
And then what is making us love, so the first time we drink coffee, it obviously, kind of similar to wine, I think. It's like as a adolescent, these things don't taste great off the bat, right? But then you start to feel the effects, right? The stimulation, and you can't get, you just want more and more of it as you get more and more used to it. And then we start to associate, I think, the taste with the feeling, and then it just becomes this thing that we just can't get enough of, right?
Yeah.
Talk to us about this kind of phenomenon in nature, maybe like how bees, are cross-pollinating or like, drawn to nectar because of the caffeine in the plants, and then kind of how this kind of shows up.
Yeah, and so I think there's like a lot of complexity here. We can kind of distinguish between what happens in the insect world, how people experience caffeine, but there are some similarities and they kind of get tied together. So one of the interesting things about, specifically bees, but also other insects as well that are pollinators, is that they will actually seek out and kind of remember plants that make caffeine. And this is because there's a very, very small amount of caffeine in the nectar. It's not enough that it triggers any type of adverse response, but what it does do is it affects their central nervous system and actually triggers long-term memory formation. Right? And their brains don't work, obviously, like the same way that a human brain does. They're much simpler, but there are these groups of cells called Kenyan complexes or cells that are responsible for long-term memory formation and how a bee may remember, say, one plant versus another. And so because this little like hint of caffeine is there triggering this memory formation, it's believed that the plant, whether it's coffee, but as well as some citrus plants also produce caffeine in their nectar. It's really a way that they've evolved to kind of trick insects to helping them cross-pollinate and propagate. And similarly, as we think about how kind of people experience caffeine, because it has this very positive association, at least for most people, there is this evolutionary advantage now that caffeine producing plants have. And Michael Pollan talks about a lot of this in his work, how people now kind of cultivate these plants specifically because they have these various desirable qualities, and now these plants are really dependent upon us to help them propagate, but that's a selective advantage. So there's kind of a lot of like complex things going on evolutionarily, both with insects as well as with people.
And as far as like, the various compounds that caffeine's forming in our brain that makes us love it so much, are the two mainly dopamine and acetylcholine?
Yeah, so this is kind of where things get like crazy complex, because anytime you deal with brain neurochemistry, it's not ever a simple answer. But we can kind of break it down into a few different ways. Caffeine has that direct effect where it's making us alert, awake because of adenosine. But the adenosine receptors are also interacting with a whole bunch of other brain receptors, including dopamine receptors. And that's one of the reasons why coffee and caffeinated products can have this positive association or this arousal, is because dopamine's tied into that as well. And it isn't actually leading to an increase in dopamine within the brain, but it's actually affecting the amount of available receptor, which kind of has a similar effect, but just kind of different mechanism. So that's kind of one of the big areas or big reasons why people experience positive qualities from caffeine, especially when it's consumed in small amounts. If you consume large amounts, you begin to kind of have some of the negative effects, which is a whole different phenomenon that caffeine's triggering. But you're also right, caffeine does lead to changes in acetylcholine levels. Acetylcholine is, again, responsible for some of that stimulatory arousal effect, but it also has a lot of effect on memory formation, right? And caffeine is viewed as one of the compounds that can really help us develop both short and long-term memory, improve cognitive performance. If you're taking it every single day, it's probably not going to have as big of an impact, but if you're consuming it periodically, it can really have a profound effect on memory. And then lastly, it's also tied to the ability to slow, at least there's some good evidence here, slow some of the long-term effects of aging and cognitive decline. So everything from dementia and Parkinson's to more just kind of general, memory deterioration that kind of the everyday person may experience. So kind of a lot of stuff that caffeine can do within the body. It's not just like that alertness, that stimulatory quality that we think we're getting from that cup of coffee.
Love it. And yes, thank you for debunking a lot of the myths out there that say that, caffeine is bad, although there are some drawbacks, and I'd love to get into those. I guess let's talk about the metabolism aspect of caffeine, and kind of the different types of people out there. I think I know what camp I'm in. I think I'm a fast metabolizer if I'm reading the research correctly. But then most people are these slow metabolizers of caffeine. Just talk to us about the genetic component there and what that actually looks like when people are consuming coffee.
Yeah, so because caffeine is so widely consumed, there's probably more data on the genetics of caffeine consumption, how it influences caffeine consumption, again, right, than any other compound out there on the face of the earth. So we know a tremendous amount. That being said, we're still learning a lot more. So I think what most people are familiar with, or if you go on 23andMe, what they report on is fast versus slow caffeine metabolism. So it's kind of like describe a little bit what happens to caffeine within the body first. So once you consume caffeine, or any caffeinated beverage, whether it's coffee, soda, energy drink, about 15 to 30 minutes, there's going to be a spike of caffeine concentration within your bloodstream, right? And that's about the same time you're going to get like that pow, that spark, of energy. But immediately your body starts to actually metabolize or break down caffeine. And this is accomplished by a set of enzymes in the liver called P450s. And what they're basically doing is kind of like chewing caffeine up, breaking it down. They're fairly ineffective at breaking caffeine apart. It takes the average person 3 to 5 hours to break down about half of the caffeine that you consume. And that's why for some people, drinking coffee or caffeinated beverages in the afternoon is going to negatively affect their sleep, is because if they're a slow metabolizer of caffeine, it's taking, say, 5, 6, 7 hours to catabolize or break down half that caffeine. It's still around when you go to sleep.
Wow.
Right? So genetically, we know that there are differences in the DNA that encode these P450 enzymes in the liver. These are called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And they either affect how much of the enzyme you make or how fast the enzyme works, right? And you could be one of those people who has just like the genetic predisposition where you're going to just catabolize that caffeine 2 or 3 hours. And you're likely going to be someone who can have 6, 7, 8 cups of coffee and not really experience any negative side effects and not have it affect your sleep. It sounds like you, Matt, may be someone who's kind of on the other end of the spectrum, where you're a slower metabolizer of or I think you said slower,
Faster.
So you're fast. So you're gifted, then, right? So like you're one of the few where like it's like if you can consume that caffeine and like it doesn't affect you the same way, like it's just a gift, right? Most of us are kind of somewhere in the middle, and then there's a group of people where it's going to take 6 to 8 hours and then they catabolize that caffeine, and those people are likely not going to drink any caffeine at all, right? And so that's really a genetic basis for how fast we catabolize caffeine. There's a whole set of research that's come out more recently that's really around how caffeine affects our feelings of stress and anxiety. And this has to do with the genetics of those receptors in our brain, the adenosine receptors. And what we've found as a field is that there are a few different SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, small genetic changes, that can have a dramatic effect on how one experiences stress and anxiety after consuming caffeine. And so about 20% of the population globally has a genetic basis to experience a high degree of anxiety after having about 150 milligrams of caffeine. And that's about the amount that you would consume in, 1 to 2 cups of coffee if you're making it at home, or it might just be like a single Starbucks coffee. Right? And these are probably people who experience a lot of that jitteriness, the nervousness from coffee, a lot of like those negative associations that some people can have.
Yeah, I'd love for you to kind of dive a little bit more into, there's obviously a lot of great things about coffee, and obviously people like myself, use it to rely on it to function every day. But yeah, talk to us about the various things that a lot of these slow metabolizers struggle with, or maybe even fast metabolizers to some extent as well, when it comes to kind of some of the dependencies and the jitters and the stress and all that.
Yeah, so let's kind of break it down. I think that one of the negative side effects is because it persists in the body so long, it can negatively affect sleep. And you were kind of alluding to this about decreasing coffee consumption about 8 hours before you go to bed. And again, this kind of ties back to like how fast your body's able to like chew through that caffeine, right? So if you're one of those people who's a slow metabolizer, you just don't want to drink coffee at all in the afternoon. Otherwise, even though you don't think it's affecting your sleep quality, there's still caffeine around. It's still impacting you, even though you don't know it. So that's kind of one group, and one negative side effect of caffeine is just it persists in the body for a long time. The second is really associated with that feeling of jitteriness, the nervousness, the restlessness that caffeine can trigger. And what these are really, kind of all these words are associated with anxiety. And what caffeine inadvertently can do is trigger the body's fight and flight response, right? And you think about, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, if you're being chased by some wild animal, you don't want to be falling asleep, right? You want to be like wide awake, you want to be going, right? So you have this rush of adrenaline, cortisol. You have an increase in blood pressure, your heart's pounding. You have all these effects that are designed to help you survive. What caffeine can inadvertently do in many people is trigger that response. But of course, it doesn't happen to everyone. There's kind of this gradation where some people who are highly caffeine sensitive, they'll get that anxiety feeling again, maybe partly because of their genetics, partly because they have a very stressful day. Then there's a whole other group of people who may not experience any of these negative side effects at all. They can have 6 to 8 cups of coffee and like all they experience are like the best possible things. But that's really kind of what's wonderful about not just like caffeine, but just about like humanity, right? Is we have like this very big spectrum of response. And then, I do think it's worth noting that caffeine is habit forming. You can use the word habit forming, you can use addictive. People do develop a dependency on caffeine. And this is because, in part, we're messing with really our body's natural sleep-wake cycle and mechanisms of regulating it. And it's actually cranking out more of these adenosine receptors, saying, hey, like something's off. But the negative consequence of that is that in the absence of our normal coffee or normal caffeine, influx, we feel more tired than we want to. And that's why caffeine and coffee end up being things that people consume every single day, is that you're trying to kind of get yourself back to a baseline level of functioning, as opposed to kind of going from like baseline and getting that extra spark. And so that's kind of like the insidious side of caffeine, is that you really only get the benefits from it if you consume it intermittently, right? And like in as few as 3 or 4 days, you can develop this tolerance to it. And then once you're tolerant, you're going to consume it more and more regularly. And then you start to experience the withdrawal effects. So it's kind of like this very, interesting relationship that we develop with coffee and caffeine. And that's actually why I don't start my day with a caffeinated or even our caffeine replacement coffee, is that I try to be a little bit mindful about why I'm taking it and just consuming it when I want that extra kind of burst of energy.
Really fascinating. Yes, I'm, self-proclaimed addicted to coffee, but although the 6 to 8 cups is definitely not me. I'm more in the 2 to 3, but I definitely feel like, there's only so much I can fit in before 2 o'clock because my bedtime is pretty early. So there's no way I could fit 6 in. And I did yesterday. I tried in preparation for this conversation. I tried to see how much I could consume, and I started feeling jittery after I did I basically started with a cortado, then I did a drip, and then I did a single shot after that. And I stacked them all pretty close to each other, like within an hour. And by the afternoon, I never crashed, but I was definitely kind of irritable and kind of.
Yep. So what you're probably seeing is like just kind of like that fringe or like that anxiety response, that fight and flight response.
Yeah.
Not so much, right, that you feel like you're in a panic, but like that's going to be early onset. And we also we developed this very interesting lexicon around caffeine, where we have these special words that are really used to describe these very negative qualities. Like over-caffeinated, right, is really kind of a nice way of saying overdosing, right? Like you basically one overdosed on caffeine, right? Jitters, right, is we have these very interesting words we use. So
I think we did a nice job setting the stage around caffeine. I'd love for you to give us the Rarebird pitch, kind of everything from the etymology of the name to how the consumer uses it, and give us the spiel.
Yeah, for sure. So let's first kind of start with, Rarebird and our mission, and it's really to help people wake up and be a better version of themselves, right? And that's kind of what we think the brand Rarebird, a concept of a Rarebird embodies, right? As we kind of think of an old-timey definition of a Rarebird, it's a very interesting person who has these great qualities about them. They're a Rarebird. But we also think about it as being something that's bright, optimistic, something that helps you get ahead without kind of helping you catch up, and that's really the goal here. We're very focused on mental health, mental wellness. We're not going to claim we can cure all, issues, but rather we want to provide solutions that really help us, incrementally make improvements that are easy to do. And, that's why coffee is something that's very interesting to us, because we do have that ritual, that routine, where, again, 2/3 of people are consuming coffee every single day. And so we saw coffee as this ability to, if you can make it better, this ability to piggyback on a routine and habit that we need to do or really want to do, and then add on extra value. And really, we do that in 2 different ways, and we'll kind of describe kind of the different products that we make. Kind of the biggest focus we have and kind of our kind of pie in the sky vision is to develop the world's first caffeine replacement. And this is a compound called Paraxanthine. We abbreviate or call it PX because Paraxanthine is very challenging to say. We get it. The chemistry gods definitely didn't bless this molecule with a name that rolls off the tongue. And most people probably never heard of paraxanthine, probably very few have. But the interesting thing is, for anyone who's ever consumed any type of caffeinated beverage, they actually know PX very well. And that's because about 75 to 80% of the caffeine that we consume is actually metabolized and converted into paraxanthine or PX.
Wow.
Right? And again, this is done by those enzymes in the liver, these P450 enzymes. These enzymes are very, very slow, right? So you never actually get to experience like PX, the benefits, how it feels, just because the amount that's in the bloodstream and the brain never reaches that high enough concentration. But PX is very interesting in terms of, the comparison and contrast with the effects of caffeine. So PX is a stimulant, just like caffeine is. So it's going to wake you up, make you alert. It's going to have that stimulatory effect. Yet it doesn't trigger the body's anxiety response the same way that caffeine can. And so it has far fewer negative side effects for most people as compared to caffeine. The absence of the jitters, the absence of the nervousness, the restlessness, kind of all these other things that people associate with having too much caffeine. Additionally, PX is metabolized faster than caffeine in the body. So it has a shorter half-life. So it's going to be a coffee that people can consume either in the afternoon, not have it negatively affect their sleep, or if they're just kind of generally concerned about their sleep and their wellness, like you can drink this in the morning and it's going to be, more of it's going to be cleared out by the time you go to bed. So it's this very, very interesting compound that our bodies are already making. So it's something we're already familiar with, our bodies know and see. We just never really have gotten to see its benefits and experience it. And so what we kind of recognize is that we could take PX, and then if we could make a coffee out of it, you have a better coffee, essentially.
Fascinating. So it's like, you're essentially getting some of the benefits of caffeine, but without a lot of those negative things that we're talking about earlier. What are the other metabolites that you could have been selecting from the this breakdown of caffeine, but you're kind of emitting from this new coffee?
Yep. Yeah, so there are two minor metabolites that your body makes. One is theobromine, and this is a naturally occurring compound that's related to caffeine structurally. It's actually found in cacao in large amounts, so chocolate, as well as some tea. And then the other one's theophylline. And theophylline, there's not much of it in your body, but it persists for a very, very long time. The half-life is something like 12 hours. So you could actually see in some people who are slow metabolizers, theophylline build up, day by day, because your body can't clear it out fast enough. Theophylline is not really that interesting as a caffeine alternative. It actually looks to perform even worse when we think about like that stress and anxiety response. And so there's not a lot of benefit we see there. It is used, I don't think it's used much, but it is an approved pharmaceutical. But I think because of a lot of the negative side effects, it isn't used in any large amount today.
Cool. So I'd love for you to talk about some of the products. I have some right here. This one is just pure PX, right?
Yes, correct.
But you also have a couple other ones with some, other interesting ingredients in there. I'd love for you to kind of just talk about the lineup and congrats on the website. It looks great. You just launched it. I'd love to kind of talk about that lineup.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, our website just went live actually last week. So we're kind of just launched, brand new, telling the story to the world. We welcome any and all feedback about what's working, what's not. So just definitely shoot me a message. In terms of product lineup, we have kind of two categories. We have the PX coffee, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail. And then we have traditional coffees that we've enhanced. And we did this because we recognized that not everyone experienced negative effects of caffeine, right? And that PX coffee may not be for them. But there was still this opportunity to make coffee even better. And so what we did was we took a traditional coffee bean and we actually infused it with a variety of different active ingredients that support different mental wellness goals.
Sure.
So we have a coffee that's geared towards kind of reducing stress. We have a coffee that's geared towards supporting long-term cognitive health. we're working on one that's really focused on memory, procrastination, kind of other different mental health
Wow.
attributes that people may be looking for. And so these are kind of all off-the-shelf active ingredients that have been studied in the clinic. They're GRAS approved. They are well explored. So there's kind of nothing new that we're doing there from understanding the pharmacology behind these compounds, but rather recognizing that we can make coffee even better by including them in kind of people's daily ritual and routine.
And I think it's just important to clarify, like for now, all of these coffees are ground. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. We have prototype versions of whole bean coffees, but frankly, they're just not ready for prime time yet. Coffee is something that people have, this romanticism around and really strong opinions about as well. And frankly, like the whole bean coffee just isn't aesthetically ready yet.
Yeah.
You don't want that kind of first experience to be like, oh, this kind of looks a little bit weird. But that's definitely like where we're going, because we understand like there's nothing better than like grinding like
Yes.
your beans fresh and brewing your cup. But for day, ground coffee.
Yeah, I can attest to, like, this is my morning alarm clock, is the sound of my grinder.
And there's a lot of like psychosomatic like responses that come with that, right? Like we have that positive association with the sound of a coffee grinder.
Right. It sounds like it's fresh, right? You feel like, it's like you're inside of a cafe, and, and it's early in the morning and you're getting that first roast, How do you go, kind of on this thread of, the fact that the whole bean doesn't look like a whole bean? How do you go about taking the caffeine out of the bean? I know this is your secret sauce, but what can you tell us? What are you allowed to tell us about this?
Yeah, so, and this is really specific towards the PX coffee, because the other coffees still have caffeine in them. They just have these additional active ingredients that we've included. But PX coffee, the way to think about it is, it is the same coffee you know and love, but without the caffeine, as PX instead. And the way we do that, there's kind of a bunch of different methods, but the easiest, kind of like the one we're practicing today, is we actually purchase high-quality decaffeinated coffee beans. And so most people are already familiar with decaf coffee. Many may have a little bit of a negative association, especially if they are like 40, 50 and older. And that's because in part, decaf coffee really, when it like kind of first came to market, was really, really bad, right? But today, like you can find like amazing quality decaffeinated coffees that, they look, smell, they taste just as good as like any other coffee. The only difference there, of course, is you don't have caffeine. But what we do to make that whole bean version of that coffee is we actually infuse the paraxanthine into the bean. And we do this before it's roasted. And then you roast it like a traditional bean, and then like out pops like the same product that you know and love. There's a lot of stuff though you have to tweak in terms of being able to do that effectively, to get the, really that aesthetic quality to like look like the bean that we see when it's coming off like your traditional, roastery. Not quite there yet, but that's where we're going.
And are you able to extend the shelf life of, let's just say, like the ground coffee, because it's paraxanthine and not just a whole ground bean?
The shelf life, so from like a regulatory perspective, the shelf life doesn't really change whether it's whole bean or ground. With ground coffee, you generally want to consume it in a shorter period of time, because once you grind it, right, you begin the process of releasing a lot of like the aromatics, a lot of the scent and flavor, volatile compounds will start to be released. So you do generally want to consume it within like 2 to 4 weeks after you receive like a bag of our coffee. But for most regular coffee consumers, like that's well within like the time frame that they're they're drinking their coffee anyways, or making their coffee.
And that process that you just described of like making the whole bean paraxanthine, the kind of prototype, is that the same way that you're making the ground coffee, or are you skipping any of those steps?
We do the infusion process post-roast with the ground coffee, and that really helps us achieve kind of like that better meet the consumer expectation today. That's probably all I can go into process-wise, just because we still have the patents that haven't published in terms of the actual, production.
Got it. Um, I guess can you talk about like what are some of those ingredients that you've added into some of the products? I'm reading off some of the list. Alpha-GPC, I can't even pronounce some of them. Magnesium glycinate, L-Theanine, Zembrine. You may have mentioned this
Yeah.
before, but any more detail you can provide would be helpful.
Yep. So let's kind of like break down the product groups. So we have one coffee, we call it Recalibrate, which is focused on decreasing stress and anxiety responses that people may have. And this includes L-theanine and Zembrine. So L-theanine is something that people probably know pretty well. It occurs in large amounts in tea, and it's why tea kind of has that calming, relaxing effect without making you feel drowsy. Zembrine is really interesting in that it is a defined formulation of an extract of a South African herb called kanna. And this is an herb that's been used for hundreds of years now, kind of traditionally, to alleviate feelings of anxiety and stress. And that's because there's a couple active ingredients in there at very, very small amounts that actually can have, again, kind of that anxiolytic activity. And so this is really a coffee that's designed to, we say, kind of help address some of the issues with modern life, right? We're all like rushed, fast paced, and maybe you want a coffee that is caffeinated, but it's a little bit like rounder on the edges, not like as harsh, like punch you in the face. And this is going to be a good coffee for you. The other coffee that includes active ingredients is called Resilience. And this is focused on, again, long-term cognitive health. And kind of harkening back to some of the benefits of caffeine and coffee more generally, is there is pretty good evidence at this point in time that it helps slow the rate of mental or cognitive decline. So we're like, okay, let's see if we can make this even better. And so what we included in this coffee are 3 active ingredients that are either depleted in our natural or our modern diet, like magnesium, which is important for memory formation. The NIH estimates that about 50% of people don't consume enough magnesium in their diet to meet the net recommended daily allowance. And so we include magnesium glycinate because it's a highly bioavailable form of magnesium that can get in your body very easily and help really kind of supplement that deficiency. And then second is phosphatidylserine, and that's a naturally occurring compound that exists in your brain that really is responsible for forming a lot of the cellular membranes on neurons. And we see that your phosphatidylserine levels decrease with age. It is one of the active ingredients that the FDA allows some language around the health benefits. They're very specific about what you can say, but because the clinical studies have been, a number of clinical studies have been completed to date, there's really good evidence that this can help slow that rate of mental deterioration. And then the last is Alpha-GPC, which is actually a precursor compound that helps form acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter associated, again, with memory formation, like we discussed earlier in this conversation, short and long-term memory formation. And Alpha-GPC is actually a prescription-only drug in the EU to help with Alzheimer's, but in the US, it is not. It is treated as a supplement or a food ingredient. So we're kind of taking advantage of the benefits here in making a fortified food. You kind of think in that regard.
Interesting. So these are all supplements you could try to source these all yourselves and take these pills, but it's just a more convenient form factor now.
Yeah, exactly. So like most people, they don't like popping pills.
Yeah.
They forget to do it.
Same.
I mean, I take a variety of like supplements for like health and like longevity.
Right.
And if you don't get that acute kind of benefit, that response, it's really hard to stick to that habit. And most people start, and within like 1 or 2 weeks after starting something new, like they stop continuing it. That's my experience. It's probably yours as well.
Yeah.
So what we kind of recognize is you can take coffee, something that you're consuming every single day, and then you can add in these additional benefits that support mental wellness and cognitive health, and kind of piggyback that thing you want to do on that thing that you're going to do every single day.
I know it's super early, but what has the anecdotal feedback been so far from your kind of like alpha beta group? I know you did a Kickstarter before this launch on your website, but can you talk to us about, I guess, on the topic of wellness, what are some of the increases in productivity or various aspects of people's lifestyles that they're reporting back to you?
Yeah, so we've done, specifically with the PX coffee, we've done a number of consumer evaluations where we have asked them about positive effects, negative side effects, and what they experience with the coffee. And what you see is that generally across the board, people are experiencing more of what you want from that cup of coffee, that increased productivity, the elevated mood, the alertness, and then less of what you don't. So the decreased feeling of restlessness, the decreased nervousness, decreased feelings of stress. And it isn't like every person experiences this coffee the same way. Again, because there's such a wide variation in terms of how people respond to caffeine. Likewise with PX, if you don't experience negative side effects from caffeine, our coffee may not be for you. But if you experience the jitteriness, that anxiety feeling, that's really where you're going to have like the most profound effect. And typically in about 2 to 3 days, people are able to say, okay, like I noticed the difference, because it isn't like every single day we experience coffee the same way either, right? We don't always have like the same effect, in part because it's dependent upon how we're feeling, what our stress level is.
And what do you, sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
I was just curious, what are some of the biggest hurdles that, that consumers report to like switching over? I guess like one of them that I see is that, if they're used to drinking a certain brand of coffee and they love the taste and aroma of that coffee, they have to kind of switch over to this new stack. But like, what are some of the new, the hurdles that that you're kind of up against?
Yeah, I think, one big one is the consumer education piece. When you're bringing to market a caffeine replacement and it has a name like Paraxanthine, right? Like there's a lot that you have to walk through in terms of what is this, what are the effects, and what we found there is like the easiest way is to just like go out and experience it, right? And like you'll feel the difference. And to help with that, what we launched and what we're selling on the website today are like these trial packs that are 4 ounces. And then we're going to start 12-ounce bags, sales of 12-ounce bags relatively soon. That's kind of like your traditional size bag of coffee. But really kind of getting just samples out so people can try it out, experience it for themselves, and then give us feedback so we can learn, what are the words people use to associate with, PX that differ, from the effect of caffeine. So I think that's kind of one big one, is just understanding how do we explain what we're doing to consumers. I think you are right that because coffee is, so beloved, right? There's a lot of expectations. So we've worked hard to craft what we think is kind of a really, really high quality coffee that, has like the aroma, the taste that's going to meet most of what people want. But it's very challenging when there's, 12 different varieties of coffee depending upon origin. There's light, dark, medium, roast. So what we're trying to do today is find something that's really, I'll say, middle of the road, where it's like not offensive to anyone from a taste perspective, and really leaning in on how it makes you feel, which is really where we want to kind of distinguish and define ourselves. That being said, going forward, we will start looking at, light and dark roast. We're just doing a medium today. We'll start looking at different varieties of coffee as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think leaning into like the feeling is definitely, that's kind of the origin of why people do it.
It's the distinguishing feature. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Right. And that's like we were saying at the beginning of the call, like, why does wine taste so good? Why does vodka taste so good to an adult? It's like, these things never tasted good to us when we started drinking them, right? Like, it's because we feel relaxed or we feel stimulated or we're energetic,
Yeah, absolutely. They are learned associations.
Yeah. Back on the Huberman thing, that's where kind of learned that from. He interviewed somebody talking about like the science of taste, in the brain, and I found that really interesting, and kind of how we've evolved to, certain things taste bad to us, or why is that? Why do certain things? How do we build positive taste associations of certain things? And a lot of it has to do with how we feel when we consume that cup of coffee or that, big glass of whiskey.
Yeah, and coffee is definitely within that category for sure.
Yeah. Kind of coming towards the end of the convo, I'd love for you to kind of look into the future. There's been, within the industry, various iterations and trends, right? You have like third wave coffee, which, I'm not sure if I know exactly what third wave coffee is, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with like what Starbucks is trying to do in those reserve roasteries or those reserve things where they're like serving cortados and it's like oat milk and it's whole fat milk and it's like, kind of anything you want. But it's not so clear to me what is fourth wave coffee. Is it push carts that are selling you, automated espressos in New York, or is it these like percent Arabica, however you pronounce it, from Japan coming to the Grove in LA? What does the future of coffee look like? And how's Rarebird playing a role in that?
Okay, so I'll give you kind of like the short answer, but it's a little like historical basis, right? Like, I mean, most of our parents and grandparents probably know like Folgers, like Maxwell House, right? And that was, I'll call it, you can call it like second wave coffee. I don't actually know like which first or second wave, like where they're defined at. And then, third wave is really defined by Starbucks is probably like the brand that people are most familiar with, but it really encompasses all of the coffees that were designed to really focus on a premium experience, right? Like the refined difference in taste, the aroma, really cultivating like that pinnacle of the aesthetics of coffee.
Okay.
And I think we kind of like reached that peak, right? Like you can find like, $100 per cup coffees out there in the world, like, kind of like wine, right? It becomes like these rarefied,
right,
different niche areas. Where I think coffee is going is two different places. I think one is, and kind of giving our own pitch, right, is thinking about coffee and reevaluating what it can be. And, I oftentimes say we're kind of changing like the heart and soul of what defines coffee. We're taking the caffeine and putting something new in and giving it a modernization, something that we think is a better fit for modern life today. And I think that others are going to look at doing that as well. Not necessarily with the caffeine replacement, but how do you take advantage of like that routine, that ritual, and like make coffee even better? Then I think there's a whole nother group of people who are working on creating, I'll call them coffee substitutes, and understanding that, there is, with climate change, there may be additional pressure, right, to reevaluate land use. The price of coffee, may increase. It takes, years for these plants to mature. So if, climate change affects the geographies of where coffee is grown, we could see a pretty big, effect in terms of consumption, just based upon, the decrease in supply. And so a lot of people are working now on trying to make things that resemble coffee as close as possible. And then, adding caffeine to that, to give you kind of the experience of coffee without actually ever using the bean. I think people are still a long, long ways away from being able to do that effectively, but it's an area I think that's going to be interesting to see kind of develop and evolve in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, molecular coffee. I totally forgot about that trend, but it's definitely something that's definitely fascinating. I would love to try. My friend Larissa Zimberoff, I think, tried Atomo coffee.
Yep.
I think they're a YC company if I'm not mistaken. But just kind of on that thread real quick. So it's like, I love the fact that you're changing the heart and soul of it, but you're not changing, the ritual around it or even necessarily like how you drink it necessarily, as far as like, I like it with frothy milk. I like it like a macchiato or, an espresso. Like, is this something that we could see at a coffee shop, you think, in the future, where in the same way that I have a million different milk options, I've now this other alternative to a bean that I can order?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, PX coffee is coffee, right? And we worked hard to make sure the experience is exactly what the consumer will expect. We oftentimes call it the third coffee, right? You have caffeinated coffee, you have decaf coffee, and you have PX coffee. And really, we don't see caffeinated coffee as ever going away. We don't see decaf coffee as ever going away. But we believe that there's space, and a pretty large space, to have this third opportunity, this third option that provides a set of distinct benefits that people may be looking for as their everyday cup, or something that they consume maybe only in the afternoon in addition to like caffeinated coffee that they have in the morning.
Yeah, I could tell, like when servers come to the dinner table at the end of the night and they say, coffee or tea, anyone? I usually just, like, these days after listening to that whole caffeine episode about, don't drink it unless it be before or after 8 hours before your bedtime, I'm just like, there's no chance in hell I'm ever gonna order a shot of espresso now and after dinner, whereas I used to. But I could definitely see this potentially being something that I have, I guess, in the late afternoon or an early dessert.
It's sorry, something you do not want to have like 6, 7, 8 p.m. at night, but like if you need that afternoon cup at work, that's probably a better use case.
Jeffrey, this has been a lot of fun rethinking coffee and coming up with this new alternative to caffeine. If people want to, check out those samples, tell us how we can get started, and then maybe if there's any other job opportunities or anything else you want to plug away, people want to get in touch with you, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so our website is rarebird.coffee. That has all our contact information. You can read about all our products. And then getting in touch with us, probably Instagram is going to be the best way, at Drink Rarebird. And just shoot us a message, and we will be happy to have a conversation and explore the future of coffee together.
Awesome. Thanks again. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you're curious to get a first-hand look at the cutting edge of food and tech, check out HNGRY.tv. That's Hungry with no U, where you can join in on live conversations like these or sign up for the free weekly newsletter.